Nau mai hoki mai ki Otherfold, e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Sarah Jane Paine, who is the research director at Growing Up in New Zealand, which is an enormous and fascinating longitudinal demographic research study run out of the University of Auckland. As with Dr. Paul Spoonley a few weeks ago, some of you might be thinking that's a bit outside of scope for the fold, and maybe it is, but it was honestly talking to Paul that sort of got me thinking about the ways in which we, as media, we're so consumed with our own analytics and our own data, and we pay a lot of attention to that of other sort of related industries, whether it's TV ratings or the radio studies, how many unique visitors Stuff has versus the Herald. But we don't think about the big glacial changes and insights into our society at a holistic level. That's why I'm such a fan of, regular listeners to this podcast will know that Where Are the Audiences Day is up there with Christmas for me. That's the New Zealand On Air research study that looks at tries to have a pan-media look at audience behaviours, and so I view this as related to that. The other reason that I'm so into this study is because I'm also on some level in this study. Our middle daughter is one of the 6,000 kids who are part of this cohort born in 2009 and 2010 who are being followed throughout their life to date. And so I know just how much detail, how broad a sense of well-being and behaviour and the factors that might drive those that goes into this study. It is hours and hours that you put into it. And as a result, the Dunedin longitudinal study is rightly very famous. This, because it starts pre-birth and because it's such a large number, has the potential to be, I think, even more interesting over time. Sarah Jane is Ngāi Tūhoi. She's comes at this research position from a Te Ao Māori lens, a kaupapa Māori lens, and is not, and talks about how some of her not necessarily her motives, but some of who she is as a researcher is about critiquing some of the ways that kind of maybe Western modes of science and research have been applied to Indigenous people. But then from there we sort of go. So we talk about her and how she came to the study. She's, the study is 14 years old now. She's been at its head since the start of last year. So and we talk about really the things they've started to learn. About young people in New Zealand, about this very specific group of them. It started out in Auckland, Kandi's Manukau, and in the Waikato, and now has spread throughout the country inevitably. It's and there are some kind of more core media specific elements. They do ask kids about their screen time and so on. Though she acknowledges that it's probably more of a blunt instrument question that will, because of the way, and you'd never have known this at the start, the extent to which screens have become such a vast proportion of the day, and what used to be a phone is now a much more complex object in terms of what you do with it. That they'll sort of likely evolve that over time. But I think the Growing Up in New Zealand study is one of the most significant and interesting pieces of research that is currently ongoing in this country. And if all goes right, everyone from the media to our political leaders to businesses will be studying its contents, deriving insights from them, and ultimately understanding better this country and particularly its young people for years to come. So this is Sarah Jane Paine, Research Director of Growing Up in New Zealand, on The Fold. Tēnā koe and welcome, Sarah Jane Paine, Research Director at Growing Up in New Zealand. I wonder if you could start by sort of explaining your path to the Research Director role, which I think you're relatively fresh in still. Is that right?
Yeah, I started as the Research Director for Growing Up in New Zealand in January 2022. So it's interesting that you describe it as a map. So I suppose for me the starting point is my whānau and is, my life story, which involves growing up in a family where education was really important and seen as a pathway to other things in life. So, growing up with parents who really encouraged me to be engaged in school and to try my best and to see university as an option and part of my future pathway. That was how I grew up, but also being around women in particular and wahine Māori who had their own ideas and their own views about the world and what was important for life and what made a good life, I think has been really formative. You don't realise these things when you're a kid, but I think back on my life and think of a number of women, and we might get to that later on. But so going into university was part of my upbringing. I don't think I probably ever imagined I would be a researcher. I don't remember that being a career option for a child of the 80s and 90s. It was sort of doctor, teacher, lawyer. And so I went off to university, did what I thought was a good idea, which was to enrol in a science degree, which again, looking back, might seem interesting because what I do a lot of now is critique science, and in particular Western science and Western knowledge systems. But that was what I really enjoyed as a young person. And so I'll fast forward a little bit, finished a couple of science degrees and thought I'd better get a real job, but again, didn't really have an understanding of what one could do with a science degree, and found myself working as a researcher in a project that was using a kaupapa Māori approach to undertaking epidemiology, and I think everyone knows what epidemiology is now, thanks to the...
I not have, but we do now.
Yeah, COVID-19, and so I mention that because that first opportunity, that first job I had when I left university, brought me together with a group of predominantly wahine Māori researchers, Māori health researchers, public health researchers that were using epidemiology as a tool to monitor the Crown in relation to health inequities, to critique the discipline of epidemiology itself and the way that it shapes all of our understandings about what health and wellbeing looks like and who suffers poor health and disease, and what interventions should be put in place. So that was a change in my map and sent me on a new trajectory, which was discovering what it meant to be a Māori who used research to answer interesting questions I had about my whānau, my communities, our society here in Aotearoa, and how we could use some of these research tools to really interrogate that, and to think about the role of systems and structures in creating that reality, but also the potential for those same systems and structures to create a new vision for Aotearoa. So I promise I'm getting to your question, how do you end up then working for Growing Up in New Zealand? I think, again, it's an opportunity to think about wellbeing not as one point in time, but the accumulation of experiences, of relationships, of policies and pressures on families, and how they support some children and young people to live full and flourishing lives, but at the same time limit the potential and opportunities of others. And so that's how I see growing up in New Zealand, the contribution we can make to a conversation here in Aotearoa around that, and really hoping I can bring that, not just a Te Ao Māori view to the study, but actually the critical gaze that comes from a kaupapa Māori positioning when we do ask questions about why do some children and young people in this country not have their basic rights being upheld.
That's really fascinating and instructive. And I guess I would love to know, actually, almost, let's baseline what the study, what its origins were and what it sets out to do, because it's a pretty extraordinary thing. I think we all, or a bunch of us, would know about the Dunedin longitudinal study, which is probably one of, even on a global scale, a really significant, way of looking at a population over time. This has the potential to be, as interesting, if not more so, because of the way it's been designed and the scope of it. So do you want to explain the nature of growing up in New Zealand?
Yeah, you're right. Growing up in New Zealand, I describe it as the longitudinal study for Aotearoa and everything that Aotearoa means to us today. So you might have heard the study being described before as New Zealand's largest contemporary longitudinal study of child and youth wellbeing, and its strengths are in the diversity of the cohort, the group of families who volunteered back in 2009 and 2010 to be part of this really amazing study and to allow us to be part of their lives so that we can understand what life is like growing up in New Zealand. So the notion that the study is both contemporary and diverse, I think, is really important. So we have the way the study was designed, we have groups of children and young people who identify as Māori, as Pacific, as Asian, as Pākehā New Zealanders. That is the makeup of our society today. And so it's really important that research reflects those different communities. We recruited families from the Auckland, counties Manukau and Waikato DHB reasons back in 2009, 2010. But fast forward to 2022, when we finished our most recent interviews, and these families are living all over Aotearoa, and again, moving around is really part of New Zealand life at the moment.
So, I mean, and that almost gets to what will make it so, I mean, I'm sure it already is making it so instructive because, and as I mentioned in the intro, my daughter is part of the cohort, so I've had a kind of a visibility over it, but also a sense of just how intricate it is, how much, when you're splitting it up, this thing is hours and it's thousands of kids. The amount of data and the ability to kind of pass what's causation, what's correlation, or, what kind of, the insights broadly that you can get out of it will be quite extraordinary. What are some of the insights which sort of leap out to you, or some of the things that you think the study is already starting to show us, in terms of that cohort, which is sort of 13, 14 years old now?
Yeah, so one of the features of a longitudinal study like ours, who recruits or invites families to take part, in our case, before the children were even born, so we had women who were pregnant at the time of their enrolment, is that it enables us to understand and document and then look at how the early years, so a lot of people talk about the first 1,000 days of life, so those prenatal influences through to the first 2 years of life for a child are really formative for creating the foundations for positive development, for securing strong, supportive relationships, generally parent-child relationships, and really ensuring that those children have everything that they need for future well-being. So, a really good example is in some of our recent research that shows that the sort of patterns of well-being you can see in a longitudinal study. You can see that some children and young people, their pathway through life from birth through to 12 years of age, it might look like a straight line, that in general they tend to do well on every measure of well-being that we look at. But actually for a large majority of families in this study, their well-being goes through a lot of what we call flux, sort of changes up and down. And I think that makes sense, not just from a scientific point of view, but just from thinking about our own lives, that in those early years, often families might drop some income as one or two parents step away from work to look after a child. And that can put a lot of pressure on a family to not have two sources of income. But then once that child grows up and they go into school, then you might see those parents or caregivers re-entering the workforce, and so income will then come up again, which is supportive of well-being. So you do see a lot of flux over a child's life. I suppose what the patterns I'm really interested in and are concerned about are some of the patterns we see where children in whānau find themselves experiencing hardship. And you'll see a pattern where we describe it as sort of being, they fall into hardship, and they stay there for a long time. They don't seem to have the supports or the resources around them to lift them back up in the same way that some other families do. And so we know from studies like the Dunedin study and like similar studies internationally, that if you stay in those experiences of hardship or disadvantage in those early years of a child's life, then that's actually setting you up for much longer term and significant health and wellbeing problems.
I mean, one of the things I had Paul Spoonley on this podcast relatively recently talking about the demography. He was particularly talking about the super diversity of Auckland, but the other thing that you sort of see is that the demography of New Zealand as a whole looks quite different from young New Zealand, and I wondered if you could talk about that sort of, how the demography of your cohort looks versus New Zealand or Aotearoa as a whole.
And that idea that New Zealand was growing into this very diverse society was informative at the very beginning of the study. The way in which the team who were there at the start looked to recruit families into the study was because there was this notion that we would see more children and young people who identify themselves in much more diverse ways than perhaps some of us older generation might do. So in our most recent round of reporting earlier this year, we released some really interesting findings that showed that 30% of our cohort identify with multiple different ethnicities. And so I think that is a really nice reflection of what Aotearoa is like today. You've got 12-year-olds who understand with and can identify with multiple different groups, Māori, Pacific, different types of European ethnic groups, different types of Asian groups. And that does both, I think, reflect that early notion that this was the path that Aotearoa was heading into. But I think for me, I'm really interested in the fact that young people see themselves in that way. And that's a really important part of forming a strong wellbeing foundation for their lives, that they can see themselves.
I mean, that speaks to one of the things I wanted to drill into a bit, which is that one of the sort of pillars that you identify as part of the research is this sort of culture and identity piece. And in some respects, in the early years, that's something that is really inevitably kind of largely driven by the parents and their responses. Now the kids are starting to be of an age where they're starting to self-direct and self-identify more in that respect. What are you seeing there that is sort of noteworthy about that sort of broad set, what way of looking at these kids?
Yeah. I suppose the first thing I would say is developing a strong sense of identity is really important for future well-being, being strong in your understanding of who you are, who are the people that you relate to, what are the beliefs and I suppose the broader cultural dynamics that you see yourself as belonging to is really important. At 8 years of age, when we interviewed the young people and we asked questions about what ethnic groups they identified with, we were able to show that, yes, young people, one, they can answer these sorts of questions, and two, when you compare their 8-year information with their 12-year information, there's a little bit of change, but not that much. So for me, the way I think about that is that these notions of identity and culture are part of a young person's life earlier than probably a lot of their parents and caregivers realise. It's not necessarily something that every family is talking about at the dinner table, but when you give children and young people an opportunity to answer those questions, then they are able to articulate that. I mean, we did also in our recent data, we not only asked young people what groups they identify with, but how they feel about their ethnic group. And I thought that was a real celebratory moment for the study and for young people again, because we showed for rangatahi Māori, for Pacific young people, for Asian young people, they have a strong sense of belonging to those groups. They feel proud to belong to those groups. They really enjoy that part of their identity. So, given the sort of the social dynamics of contemporary societies, these young people feel really good in themselves. So my question, not just of the study, but for all of us is, what are we doing when we start to chip away at that strong sense of identity? You see in other research, and particularly through the adolescent years, that there can be a bit of erosion of that strength of identity. And I don't believe that's any doubt in the young person's mind, but a lot of the pressures that society puts on young people and questioning who they are and what role they have to do in our communities.
I mean, that sort of leads me to the closest we'll get to sort of core media, and I'm not actually certain to what to what extent you can answer this, but the other thing that's fascinating, I mean, there's so many. You got very lucky with the cohort in some respects, right? Because I think about 2009-10 when you sort of picked them up was essentially where that was really the moment when the internet and smartphones were coming on stream. The monoculture, the behaviours that maybe you and I grew up with, were starting to become aberrant for young people rather than natural for them. Firstly, to what extent do you look at their sort of their time online, their behaviours online, that whole piece of their sort of behaviour or kind of cultural kind of outlook, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, we would be foolish as a research project not to ask young people in our cohort about their social media use and how much time they're spending on devices, because, like you say, it's such a dominant feature of all of our lives today. And so there have been questions asked of the cohort around that, and some nice analysis looking at time spent on social media and trying to tease out some of the potential impacts it has on well-being. I suppose one of the things that we should be thinking about is really the normalisation of devices and social media within our lives. So what I mean by that is at one point we would have been asking questions about device use because it was a peculiarity, maybe that was this new thing that was encroaching on a young person's life, and see it as a risk, and there are definitely some risks related to time spent on devices, related to the type of content that is being shared and put in front of our young people. But actually, moving forward is such a normal part of our lives. You know, we need to really think more about the way in which social media and device use is portrayed as a risk in some instances. But if we look at our research that we did with the cohort during the first parts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the way in which device use enabled our children and young people to stay engaged with school, to be able to FaceTime whānau and friends, and to really ensure that those relationships, which are critical to how they feel in terms of their emotional well-being, they then become a positive sort of tool that we can use. So I think there is room for us to be a bit more nuanced about how we think about devices from the point of view of young people, not from our sort of analogue way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, there's a huge complexity there, and and even down to your sort of that point you were making before about people's identity being, that can be something that's really nourished in those spaces. It can also be something where it's eroded depending on the kinds of content people are exposed to in what particular environments. Do you go through a device into a sort of a platform or level, or is it where does it end, I guess, is the question I'm asking, in terms of how deep and textured your research is in those areas?
Yeah, I would say, Duncan, probably a bit superficial, because of this view we've all come from that, social media is this sort of singular thing, that there are only a couple of devices that we're talking about, mobile phones and maybe an iPad if the child was lucky, but it is in everything that we use every day, including in the ways that our children, even while they're in the classroom environment, are using the internet and are using different types of devices to enhance their learning. So I think if this is something that we're going to do more research on, we do need to have a more complex gaze over what it is and why we think it might disrupt and or enhance well-being. I think that's the question.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's the opportunity, because the government often does a lot of different pieces of research, some of which kind of overlap well. Like there's a study I'm really interested in called "Where Are the Audiences," which New Zealand On Air does, and has got a particular kind of rangatahi stream associated with that, but which is very detailed down to kind of time spent and so on, but then has none of this sort of health and well-being overlay. So sometimes you're like, I just wish these things could match up, You mentioned the pandemic before. That obviously is an awful thing, but also an extraordinary thing in terms of this, just a singular event to be forced through everyone's lives associated, and at a very particular age group. Also a challenge to actually completing the research, a lot of which has historically been done face to face. How did you handle it, and what are you starting to see out of how it has impacted your cohort?
Yeah, so we, like you say, we were very fortunate that we have a supportive and engaged cohort or group of families that are a part of the Growing Up in New Zealand study. So back in 2020, when COVID-19 arrived here in Aotearoa, and we all went into those very strict public health restrictions and lockdowns, the team at the time had the foresight to think this is a pivotal moment, not just for Aotearoa and the world, but actually a pivotal moment in a child's life to go through such an experience. So that team got together and they created an interview, a questionnaire for our families to understand what the experience was like, to understand how people essentially were spending their time at home while we were all in lockdown, but then importantly to think about what some of the potential impacts of those lockdown measures might have for young people at that time, but moving into the future. So that was the first time the Growing Up in New Zealand team pivoted to a fully online interview. So previously, and I think it's been really important in the early stages of the study and when the young people were babies and children, our team would bring whānau and make an appointment to go literally into their homes and spend how many hours, Duncan? 1, 2, maybe 3.
Yeah, it was a while.
Yeah.
You got familiar.
There in your living rooms, probably going through very comprehensive questions, which has meant that we have this very rich source of information about wellbeing. But none of us would have been able to tolerate that under lockdown conditions. And so it was a really important moment for us to think about how do we collect information that respects the challenging and stressful environments the whānau we're all going through during COVID-19, but will allow us to provide some really important insights that can inform sort of future pandemic responses. So that was the work that was done in 2020. And the things I remember about that particular interview was, yes, it was a difficult time, but actually when you ask the children themselves, they told us in their interview and in the questions we asked, they actually really enjoyed being around people. So lockdown meant that they had more time with important adults in their lives, typically parents, but whoever else was in their bubble, as we were describing it. And so they enjoyed the time with other adults. They enjoyed the baking or the walks or whatever it was that we were all trying to busy ourselves with while we were working and managing pandemic stresses. And so there are those sorts of benefits for children and young people from that 2020 survey. Some of the questions we asked about their satisfaction around education were slightly more challenging for young people. And again, because you're a parent, Duncan, as am I, having to connect our children into online learning, having to remember how to do intermediate level maths, that was all pretty stressful for everyone. So I think the survey that we did in 2020 was a very good reflection of what actually the whole of Aotearoa were probably feeling at the time. If we skip ahead to 2021, the team at that point, we had always been planning to do an interview with the cohort, what we call the 12-year interview, so interviewing the young people when they were roughly 12 years of age. And so there's a lot of work and preparation that goes into creating those 3-hour interviews that you all sit through. And our team we're ready. We'd gone through the process of planning. We'd done all our consultation work that was necessary. And August 2021, we all went back into a level 4 lockdown. That was the start of the
long Auckland lockdown.
The long Auckland outbreak. So for our team, it meant, again, taking a pause and thinking about what we could do to continue with the interview, but to do it in a way that met the public health restrictions and hopefully, Duncan, wasn't too burdensome for whānau. And so that time we did what we called a remote real-time interview, where we tried to use Zoom. We were all suddenly very familiar with Zoom due to COVID. Tried to use Zoom as a technology to give young people some support from our trained interviewers, but also providing some options around completing it independently via a link. And you know, that first outbreak in 2021 then rolled onto another outbreak in 2022. And so although we had hoped at some point we'd be able to get back in sort of a physical space, maybe not face-to-face, but in a physical space with our cohort whānau, that wasn't possible. And so there were a lot of challenges for family. families going through COVID. And so the fact that we were able to complete 4,500 interviews as part of our 12-year data collection wave, I think is a real testament to the commitment that whānau have. I mean, I should probably ask you this question, Duncan, but it seems to me that families in our study have every excuse to not do an interview, and yet they put up with us during 2 COVID-19 lockdowns. I mean, it must say something about the importance of the study to these families.
Yeah, it absolutely feels like you're privileged to be a sort of a speck, but still a meaningful part of this this thing that has the potential to provide like a solid foundation for us just understanding in such a more rich and textured way what really impacts on people's lives, and and ultimately what kind of policy or just behavioural changes you might make that can kind of address some things which have seemed really pernicious in New Zealand society. Are you at that? I mean, the study is ongoing, and as I understand it, has just been powered up for longer again, which is fantastic. But at what point, like, are you already at the stage where you're starting to sort of see things where you kind of are trying to kind of put those into places where they might actually become actionable insights as opposed to just, gee, that's interesting?
Yeah. So I should say that was this idea that the information and insights that come from the Growing Up in New Zealand study, it was always imagined that it would help to shape and inform policies that were going to ensure that Aotearoa was the best place in the world to grow up to be a child. And so that was the original vision for the study. It hasn't just been this interesting thing that a group of researchers thought might be neat to do. We've had support from government from the very beginning to make sure that the data we collect and the research that we and many other researchers from around Aotearoa do have pathways or there are mechanisms in place so that it is going into government ministries, it is being fed up to ministers so that they are making we hope better decisions for children, young people and whānau based on evidence, and based on evidence that comes from Aotearoa and reflects the realities of children and young people growing up today. So there are examples where Growing Up in New Zealand data has helped to create safer playgrounds for young people. A lot of our research into food and nutrition has supported infant feeding guidelines. Some of our amazing student researchers have done research into immunisation that is again being fed into the Ministry of Health. I saw a recent announcement around the fortification of flour to reduce the risk of some really serious birth defects. And again, Growing Up in New Zealand data has been part of the evidence base that are shaping these really important health and wellbeing policies. What I'm really interested in doing in this next phase of Growing Up in New Zealand is not just using the data that comes from families to share with people who are in positions of power, but thinking about how we bring young people themselves into that decision-making process. And so, again, I think you'd need to be hiding under a rock if you haven't seen the power of rangatahi, or the power of young people's voices. You know, we're talking again, or young people are talking again about lowering the voting age. They've been on the streets championing Papatūānuku and the importance of looking after our place and our planet. They're talking about the rights of rainbow communities. And so how I think we at Growing Up in New Zealand, yes, we provide important and rich source of evidence, of data, but I think we could also enable young people to be more fully part of the study, for their voices not just to be heard through the interview, but through our research and through some of the really, I say privileged, the real privileged opportunities we have to talk to people who make decisions, and to enable young people to be part of that conversation. I think they have a lot of influence, and we're really talking about their lives and futures. And so now's the time for us to let them speak for themselves and speak to their aspirations, I think.
Absolutely. Lastly, again, thinking about the context of this as a podcast for people working in and around media, and we've talked about the policy implications, which are sort of fairly obvious, but there is I think, and you touched on it there, a sort of a broader sense that a lot more facets of society can look at the data and just the incredible richness of what has flown out of it and how it reflects and helps you understand what will ultimately become. These are early high school now. Within a few years, they'll be in the workforce, in higher education, in all kinds of different environments. What do you think is the best way for society more broadly to engage with the study and the sort of stories it has to tell, the lessons it has to teach about about this group?
I think the first thing that comes to mind actually is about the people and groups that I work with, actually. So I mentioned the word privilege before. The team, we are in a very privileged position to be part of this study called Growing Up in New Zealand, to work so closely with whānau and young people, to have the ability to take the information we're gathering from young people and to share it with people in power. But actually, if I step back from that a little bit, the way in which data and evidence has been used to privilege particular voices, often research voices and academic voices, it has a very long history in and of itself. And many of us have built our careers and had amazing opportunities through doing that. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is unlocking the power of the data so that it is not there just for people who are called researchers. It is there, and we are sharing it in ways that young people from the study, they might like to take a piece of research and use it for maybe they want to use it for a school project, or maybe they're part of a group or a club or society that wants to advocate for something or is trying to push a particular issue. How do we unlock the data that we have and recreate it in ways that's useful for other groups? Again, a lot of the wellbeing issues that our research can really support, things like child poverty, things like food insecurity, things related to our housing crisis, we as researchers and policymakers have an important role to play in addressing those issues. But there are NGO groups, there are school communities, there are hapu and iwi who are also fighting for those same things. So again, I'm really interested in how we as researchers can unlock it. And I wonder, to your point, the way in which we can use other channels, media channels, social media channels, different types of platforms to make data available. Because the traditional way is the academic journal article, which is usually paywalled and written in a way that's so inaccessible that, even after 20-something years of doing research myself, I wonder what I'm reading. And when we know that there's power in data, we need to find ways to not reinterpret it, but to share it back to those communities that have actually generously supported decades and decades of research and evidence here in Aotearoa.
I think that's a beautiful place to end it, and a good kind of wero to people in the media and to everyone with proximity to the study about opening it up and letting it sort of move and cross-pollinate. Thank you, Sarah Jane, so much for coming on the fold today. It's honestly the most extraordinary study that you're at the head of now, and really looking forward to watching it continue to evolve.
Kia ora, Duncan, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for your participation.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to O Media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.